Hi everyone, this video is to review the expectations for the clinical vignette part 1. So this vignette occurs in 2 parts, so you will be combining the 2 for the second vignette. You are to, in week 1, select a person, hopefully from a different subculture from your own. You need to choose someone that you have worked with in the past, or might be working with in the present. However, you are not completing this assignment by interacting with that person. You are only going to use information that maybe you have access to, like documentation, or what you remember from working with that person. Okay? If you do not have a person, you need to contact me for permission to use a film. Usually people use a film, but you could use a case from, from the literature too. I have had students, use a book. It's not a problem. If you don't have somebody, we can work on that. You just have to talk to me about the fact that you don't have a person and you need permission to use somebody. You may not use family or friends, because in practice, this would clearly be a conflict of interest. You are not, as a practitioner, going to ethically treat people that you know very well. You don't treat people that who are your coworkers, who are your neighbors, who are your friends, who are your family. And then Anita and Danny, who are case examples that we use in the course, they're also not an option. If you have any problems at all, just let me know. I'll help you. Okay, so in the first part of the vignette, you are covering background information. So this helps us to begin to organize how we are explaining what is happening for a person. It is very much a part of the assessment. It also gives us some clues to whether or not the person has some risk factors for a any kind of mental health condition. And in this particular vignette, you will have access to looking at 2 categories of diagnoses. You cannot go outside of these categories, no matter what the person's diagnosis is. So, I'll get to that in just a second, okay? Introduction, you talk about what your role is with the client and how you know the client, like in what context do you work with the person? What are the data sources for the report? Where did you get this information? And what was the source of the referral? That's different. Who made the referral? Did the person self-refer? Or was the referral made by, another person? Maybe the court system was the referral system. Maybe children and youth was the referral, the source of the referral. Okay, and then you're going to create like a demographics paragraph. You're not explaining anything here. You're just essentially, one sentence for each of these, or listing it in some way. And so this is just to give us, again, a brief overview of the person. You'll have a chance to do more explanation in other parts of this vignette. So if you go through this list and you don't have information, don't make it up. Just say, this information is not available. And that is real life. We meet people and we begin an assessment with them and they're willing to tell us some things about themselves, and maybe they're not willing to tell us about other things, or there's information that's not available in the record. That's real life. That happens. So rather than making it up or not addressing it at all, make sure that you just say, not available in the record, or the person didn't offer this information. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, you're not meeting with the person. You're only gathering information or referring to information that comes from a record or from your memory, essentially. Okay? So next up is the presenting problem and the chief complaint, which I find students confuse pretty frequently. So let's try to sort that out now. The presenting problem is the reason why the person came for services. So somebody was arrested. The court mandated them to come for the service for therapy. That's the presenting problem. What were they arrested for? What did the court mandate that they come and get? What kind of services? Maybe the person is going through a divorce and they, the problem situation, they might tell you a little bit about what led up to them coming in, but the central focus of why they're coming is that divorce. So this is a concise description. What was the problem that the person came for? Now, after they're there for a while, there may be other problems that are revealed, and that's not what they presented with. So it's just this presenting problem that you're referring to. And later you'll give the context of the problem. So this is just the problem. The chief complaint, which may or may not be the same as the presenting problem. So let's use the legal example. A person gets arrested, they're mandated by the court to come to therapy. You say to the person, "Why are you here?" They say, "I don't know." That's their chief complaint. If they say, "I don't know why I'm here. They made me come. I should never have been arrested." That is their chief complaint. Or they might say, "I'm here because I'm going through a divorce. Life has been tough. I don't know what to do about this." That's their chief complaint, very much like the presenting problem. Okay? In the history of the presenting problem, you're going back to where the problem began, and you're giving a historical overview of the development of the problem, still focused on the problem, okay? Then you're going to offer a psychosocial history. This is a bigger, broader perspective of the person. What else do you know about this person? Like, what's going on in their family, and what are major events that they've experienced? Do they have any history of trauma? What were their school experiences like? What would be, maybe they have lost jobs and that's part of their background, right? They have losses. Lots of people in their life have passed away or died. They have, interpersonal violence that they've experienced. They've maybe lived in shelters, and then they've lived on the streets, and they've, doubled up with some family members. So that is a big, broader background. This is what gives us risk factors. Tells us, what is this person potentially going to experience in the future based on what their past experiences have been. So let's say they have a lot of depth to their trauma history, but their presenting problem is that they got fired from work. Well, that trauma history might very well be um, has impacted them in such a way that they're not able to cope effectively in a workplace. From their perspective, they lost their job. That's the problem. But we begin to see a bigger picture. We get richer detail that might explain why the person ended up in the situation that they're in. The same thing for legal issues, Maybe there is a background of a trauma history, and the only way that the person ever really knew how to cope with the world was by taking things from other people. Well, they get to a certain age and now taking things that's illegal, and then they get arrested. So there's a deeper picture to the person that we are developing here in the psychosocial history. Then you make a list of the person's current diagnoses and their current medications, and you are going to then state from your own opinion whether or not you agree or disagree with the person's current diagnoses, and you're going to say why. Now, this assignment comes fairly early in the course. So you're not going to have, unless you already have experience using the DSM and making a diagnosis, you're not going to have a lot of information. But that's okay. You're just saying whether or not you think this is true. And then you're giving a rationale about why you think it's true. You might later in the course change your mind. That's perfectly okay. In fact, we hope that your experience is an evolving experience in understanding mental health conditions and then applying that knowledge to this particular person. And then you're finally going to use a diagnostic assessment looking at whether or not the person has any history of substance-related or addictive conditions, trauma, and stressor-related conditions, and anxiety disorders. And that's it. You can't go outside of there. So let's just say the person was diagnosed, 10 years ago with schizophrenia. You can't diagnose them with schizophrenia. They might still have schizophrenia, but for the purposes of this assignment, you are going to look for other potential diagnoses. The same thing would be true if you're working with somebody who's on the autism spectrum. We understand that that person still has autism, but do they have trauma in their history? Are they using substances? Do they have symptoms of anxiety disorders? Okay? So here are the steps in the process. In the grading rubric, gives you a little bit more information about each one. Now, let's go to diagnostic assessment. The whole process of the diagnosis begins with looking for that person's behavioral manifestations, their signs, symptoms, potential risk factors, like what are they doing? What is the outward expression of what might be a mental health condition? What are they doing? Okay? Or maybe there are risk factors. So you're also going to talk about that. They might not have particular symptoms, but they might have risk factors. So that will be addressed in this section. And then from the list of all of these substances, of all the trauma and stressor related, of all of the anxiety disorders, you will look at these symptoms and say, you know what, I'm kind of leaning in the direction of, well, they have trauma in their history. I'm thinking they might have a trauma diagnosis. So then you go to the DSM and you look at what the categories are and you say, well, they're an adult, not a child, so that rules out a couple of trauma diagnoses. But then maybe PTSD would be an option, or acute stress disorder might be. So you're just going to say what you think are the possibilities based on these behavioral manifestations, signs, and symptoms. What are they? What might be possible? You're not actually, you're just looking at the diagnoses. You're saying, I'm leaning in this direction, and I'm making a list of diagnoses, which I think could be possibilities. So now, in order to determine whether or not they are real possibilities, we need to go back to the DSM and look at the criteria for those provisional diagnoses and identify which of the person's behavior, signs, and symptoms might be evidence of that particular DSM diagnosis, that they meet the criteria for. So you'll be using the letter and number of the criteria in the DSM for that diagnosis. Okay? So you might legitimately have 2 or 3, 4 or 5 diagnoses here that provisionally you think are possible. But then when you start looking at the signs and symptoms, you might find that there's really only 2 or 3 maybe that the person has some symptoms of, but they need enough symptoms to meet the criteria. And then that diagnosis would become a differential diagnosis. Now, they could have 2 diagnoses that meet the criteria. They're both differential diagnoses. And you're going to explain your rationale for choosing these differential diagnoses. So here you're listing the criteria that they've met. Here you're discussing that. You're not taking the criteria and listing it in here. This is where you're going to make your explanation for why you chose those diagnoses. Now, the provisional diagnoses, so say you start out with 5 or 6 provisional diagnoses, you narrow them down to 2 or 3 here, you then have 1 or 2 differential diagnoses. In the process, you've eliminated some diagnoses, and that's this list, the list of ruled out diagnoses. And then you're going to explain your rationale for why you ruled out these diagnoses. Now you're saying to yourself maybe, oh my gosh, this is really a tedious process. There's so many steps. Well, making a diagnosis is a huge responsibility, isn't it? Because the outcome of the diagnosis is a treatment. And if we come to the wrong diagnostic conclusion, the person may be incorrectly treated, and they could be harmed in the process of that treatment. And that's why, of course, later we want to go back and revisit whether or not the person actually has the diagnoses that we think, so that we can change things along the way. All right? But you do want to go through a process. Okay, so that is it. And I'll give you some other videos and ideas about going through this diagnostic process. This is not the only time I'll talk about it. All right, so if you have questions, you will ask me and ask the instructor, or you will send me an email through the Engage email system. Okay, thank you.